Hello student, I'm Dr. Smita Patil and today I'm going to speak about the Hindu family law which is going to deal with largely the debates on the Hindu family laws. So the aim and objective of this lecture is to understand the debates on the Hindu family laws, the significant contribution of the scholars and how the codification takes place, how the colonial issues were there during that time. And eventually that the contemporary discourse of these laws. So let us try to understand who is Hindu, and I am quoting this definition from Flavia Agnes books which she contributed in 2011. A person who practices Hinduism is a Hindu, but a person who does not cease to be a Hindu nor less of a Hindu merely because a person has ceased to have a faith in a Hindu religion or a philosophy or does not practice or profess it. Supreme Court in 1966, and there was a case, Satsangi, Satsang case, which is famous case, in which that I am again quoting from this case which Flavia quoted, the acceptance of the Vedas with reversions, recognition of the facts that the means of the ways to salvation are diverse and realization of the truth that the number of the gods to be worshipped is large are the distinguishing features of the Hindu religion, unquote. In the context of the entry of the scheduled caste belonging to the Satsangis of the Swaminarayan Sampradaya. Now the case was dealing with this. And then further Agnes says that, and I quote again, the test of whether a person is a Hindu for legal purposes start with the ethnic and geographical test, which raises a presumption that can be rebutted not by the proof of the absence of the belief or presence of the disbelief, but only proof of only exclusive adherences on conversion to a foreign non-Hindu faith, unquote. There is also been a legal scholar, Verner Matsky, who did a pioneering work on the Hindu laws, Hindu family laws and Hindu laws, and I quote from his work, Hindu laws as a family law rather than one single unit, unquote. Hindu law as a group of the social legal system of, and again he calls it quote unquote parallel complexity, feudality and diversity evading codification, unquote. Therefore Hindu law is embedded in a very legal system, as Verner Matsky argues. Now Hindu law abounds with a high caste Sanskrit aspect, subaltern's perspective. It is argued that, and again quote from Derrida, that the Hindus are as a diverse in a race, then there is a different kind of psychology, habitat, employment and the way of life as any collection of the human beings and might be gathered from the ends of the truth, unquote. Now there is also something called as scriptural sources of the laws, which we have to understand. The diverse scriptural sources are there, which is called divine and revelations, and the early period hardly boundaries between the religion, law and morality, which is called dharma. Now there are three sources of the dharma, the Shruti, Smriti and Sadacharya. Now in the Shruti, the divine revelations or the attorneys, primarily the Vedas. The Smriti includes the memorized word, Dharma Sutras or Dharma Shastras, and Sadacharya means the good custom, as Desai pointed out. Now jurists consider Vedas as a central to the Hindu law. Codified laws related to the Hindu marriage and the family relationship originates from the Smritis and Nibandhans and the commentators and the digest, and the guidelines related to the social relation in the Smritis, which is then the 18th century BC to 5th century AD. Who were the authors of the Smritis? Then this is the question we need to ask. Now the Smritikaras not only says that not kings, religious heads, legislature. Smritikaras were the philosopher, teachers, social thinkers. For them, dharma as a code of conduct related to the diverse aspect of the life, spiritual to all the aspects of the life. Now the Dharma Shastras engage with the law, ethics and morality. 55 rules as mandatory, directory and operates as a guidelines, unwritten and orally transmitted texts, for example Guru Shishya Parampara or the Brahminical priesthood. Through generational transformation, it also got adapted to the contemporary context. It led to the gradual transformation of the Smritis. It also led to the contradictions also, as Agnes pointed out. Now, Nibandhas, detailed commentators on the Smritis, which I mentioned already, the 5th to 8th century AD, authors had the autonomy to reinterpret real precepts according to the social organization. Two hegemonic scholars under the Anglo-Hindu law are the following laws. Now, the Mitakshara of the Vijayanashwar, which is the 11th century rest of the British India, and the Dayabhaga of the Jammutavahana, which is a 12th century, which was there, ruling in the Bengal. Now, the regional divisions within the Mitakshara were Mithila, Banaras, Bombay and Dravida school. The East India Company, from the trading to the political discourse, formation of the course based on the Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence was there, and the impact of the colonizers on the economic, political and legal issues were there. The colonial modernity and the social movement was also parallelly going, and one would see the impact on the laws. The impact and the conflict between the tradition and the colonial modernity, which can be seen, and many historians also talked about it. Entry of the Hindu social reformers and the societal legal transformation can be seen through that. The important legislation happened during that period. Like for instance, the Sati Regulation Act of 1829, Widow Remarriage Act of 1856, the Age of Consent Act of 1860-1891, and the personal laws or the native jurisprudence also was there. And it has also impact, which Agnes Collett, and I quote again, carved out space for men's individual property rights into a system based on joint family property and rigid caste affiliation, and laid the ground for the introduction of the capital mode of production into urban setting, unquote. Impact on the Hindu woman's right to the property and its curtailment was there. Stridhana as an accepted principle for the British India. Now, the property of the widows, which again I quote from her work, legal necessity or a religious or charitable purposes, and upon her death, the property reverted to the husband's male heirs. The introduction of the notion of the revisioners, which was borrowed from the English law into Hindu law, bestowed upon the male relations the right to challenge all property dealing by the Hindu widows. To set rights with distortion of the Hindu law, the Hindu Women's Right to Property Act in 1937, and I am again quoting this very interesting work which is called the Deshmukh Act or the G.V. Deshmukh, was entangled, emerged in order to control the problems created by English courts constraint over Stridhana. Now, let us also try to understand this debate on understanding on marriage and divorce. The Hindu marriage as a sanskara and a contract, if you in detail see that, the debates. So, according to the Smritis, the marriage is an important samskara, religious obligation. It is observed that, and I quote, marriage was mandatory to discharge the debt of one's ancestor, the debt of begetting offspring, unquote. Marriage as an important for religious and spiritual duties, wife as a dharmapatni, sacred union. In addition to that, patni, the wife, or grihapatni, housewife, and ardhangini, half of him, which is again quoted, and these are these kind of phrases were used according to the law. So, the performance of the religious rituals and the ceremonies are important, and sacrosanct marital bonds were dissolute and eternal, and the virginity and chastity of the woman was highly prized and was praised by the Smritis, as Agnes quoted. So the Hindu marriages were non-monogamous for Agnes until the advent of the Hindu Marriage Act in 1955. So it is further observed that strict code of sexual purity was applicable only to women, and in the need of progeny, husband can have a multiple wives. So therefore it is analyzed that, and I quote, that during the early pastoral stage and the Vedic period, the husband could also appropriate the children born to those wives out of their alliances through the institutionship of the sonship. And I quote, double quote, sonship to fulfill the spiritual obligation or for the temporal objectives such as the property devolution. And it is unquoted. Understand further, one has to look at how this debate goes further. So children from the informal alliances received the recognition under the legal practice called Dasiputra. There were exceptions in indissoluble marriages allowed in the context of the death of the first husband. Now, according to Agnes, and she quotes Kautilya's Arthashastra, the husband or the wife can opt divorce on the basis of animosity between the couples and etc. So, interpolations according to the scholar in the later part of the religious development has happened, and this is the fantastic one which Kuppaswamy cited by Agnes, in which that one would see that how the legal system eventually evolves. And it is observed that therefore that, and I quote again, lower castes were not governed by this code of sexual purity, and divorce and remarriages of women were permitted among many castes, unquote. So therefore then one has to go further and look at how the introduction and the framing of the women's right to divorce bill in the parliament, which I already mentioned, the Deshmukh Act in 1938, enactment of the Hindu Women's Property Right Bill, which emerged in the 1937. For instance, the Nata marriages in the Deccan area, marriage of the divorces and the widows used to happen. So the gradual rigidity of the child marriages and the bondage of the sexual slavery was also happening. Introduction to the concept of the divorce under the Christian marriages and the English law converted marriage from sacrosanct to dissolution contracts, and you would see that the upper caste woman and the equal rights of the divorce like their husband. Enactment of the Hindu Marriage Act of 1955, Hindu marriages as a contract between two consenting adults emerge. So as again Flavia Agnes quote that Terence expressed his anxiety as to whether the reform have destroyed the essential character of the ancient Hindu law by introducing a Western model of the family law within the tradition bound Hindu society. And you would see this whole tension or the complexity between the old and the as the colonizers entered, how the laws have been changed. So one of the central question raised, contractual Hindu marriage retain sacrosanct facets of the Hindu marriages or not, which Oberoi argues, and equality between the husband and the wife, the Hindu Marriage Act of 1955 emerge. So equality will be improved the condition of the women within the family, and the equal rights and the obligation for each other must be there. So therefore it is observed that the Hindu woman was under the legal obligation to maintain her husband based on the Western idea of the formal equality. And since the notion of the undivided Hindu family property was retained, women were detained the right to ancestral property as a daughters. Yet the basic economic as well as the status inequality that prevailed under the strange notion of equality, women were considered as an equal partner possessing equal capacity to provide maintenance to their husband. And it's a very famous again the work Lalit Mohan and V. Tripathi Devi's work. So the issues related to conjugation and restitution, wives and husband remains there. So, according to then Hindu law, the marriage is a holy union for the performance of the marital duties with her husband, where he may choose to reside and to fulfill her duties in her husband's home. And again in 1973 Haryana court in Surinder Kaur versus Gurdeep Singh, this case was there. I am quoting this case law, and it stated that, and I quote, the Hindu law imposes on the wife the duty of attendance, obedience to, and the veneration for the husband to live with him, whosoever she chooses to reside, and I unquote. So, the Hindu Marriage Act then therefore transformed the Hindu marriage from the status to dissoluble contract. The form of the solemnizing the contract remained Brahmanical and scriptural, with Vivaha, the sacred fire, and Saptapadi, 7-step round the sacred fire, which is also there. So, the Hindu marriage then further linked to the community practices that are non-institutionalized in nature, and the statutory and the customary law before the constitution have to operate within the constitutional mandate. So, critique to the ancient Hindu laws suggest how it impacts the sexual and economic freedom of the woman. Right to property ownership in the colonial era challenged the traditional understanding related to the freedom of the woman. So, departed from the Manu's understanding, and again quote from Agnes' work, a woman must be dependent upon her father in childhood, upon her husband in the youth, upon her son in the old age, and she should never be free, unquote. So, the feudal ethos impacted the Smritis. Therefore, according to the Mitakshara law, the property of the Hindu law devolved through the survivorship jointly upon 4 generations of the male heirs. The ownership was by birth and not by succession. Upon his birth, the male members acquired the right to property. So then the question comes in about understanding the Stridhana. The earlier Smritikaras, the Gautama and the Manu, describe 6 categories of women's property, which we call it Stridhan. The Smritikaras such as Vishnu and the others, such as Yagna Valya, Katavayana, Narada, devils, etc., contributed to this discourse. Now, Katyayana's Smriti much focus on Stridhan, on exclusive ownership, sale and gift. Neither the husband nor the son nor the father nor the brother have the authority over and to take it or to give it away. The legal obligation for the husband as well. Sir Henry Mallin, when he talks on Stridhana, he argued that it is certainly remarkable that the institution seems to have been developed among the Hindus at a period relatively much earlier than among the Romans. And in the Mitakshara, as I mentioned to you, in the 11th century, discussed sources of the Anglo-Hindu law, which is laid the property obtained by the woman through inheritance, purchase, partition, adverse possessions, and finding in her Stridhana, and the property under the category of the Stridhana, and woman got the ownership of that property. At the same time, it's also been important to understand the Dayabhaga debate, which was there in 12th century AD, which recognized the authority of the Bengal school. At the same time, it did not recognize the joint male ownership, gifts and movable central property as in Stridhana. Now, Bombay, Banaras and Dravida schools emphasize Stridhana as a property acquired by the woman of her own and the line of descent is again integral to Stridhana, inheritance through female descent, integral to ancient moral, ethical, legal norms. Conflict between Smriti frameworks and the patriarchal transformation within the institution family took place. Now, the Mitakshara broadened the Stridhana to include property acquired by the woman through every source, including inheritance and partition. And therefore I just want to conclude, because before this lecture, that through this lecture what we try to understand that how the Hindu family law emerge and what are the historical consequence, what are the cases after independence, the couple of case studies which are highlighted here to make you understand that how the shift had happened. Eventually in 1955 one would see that the Hindu rights, Hindu family law has given all sorts of rights to the woman, and there is always been changes, and one would always see the the Law Commission website or the Government of India's website to understand the further changes, the latest changes which are happening in the Hindu family laws, what are the demands of the feminist group, what are the demands of the individual, the ways in which the case laws has taken shape. And there has always been the intervention by the people and the government in order to bring out the new sort of sites. So you can always log in, and I would recommend you to read some of the work, for instance Flavia Agnes work which is on the family law, part 1 and part 2, which got published by Oxford University Press. Thank you.